Ambassador, it's a pleasure, it's an honor to have you here. Ambassador Dr. Clemens von Goetze, brings a wealth of experience from around the world, as well as particularly, from Asia. He's been the ambassador here in Tokyo now for 2 years. And before that, he was the German ambassador in Beijing. So lots of experience and a wealth of insight. And we very much look forward, to your remarks. And then we'll have a little bit of a fireside chat. And then we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. So, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Mr. Koll. Ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure to be here. And thank you very much to the Asia Society for offering that opportunity to present the state of German-Japanese relations. I'll start with a short historic overview. I mean, I will not overburden you with historic lectures, but for us, it's very important that we have been in diplomatic relations with Japan from very early on, and sending traders here, doing business from the very early Meiji era on. And not only that, I think we have been quite active in technology transfer, know-how transfer in very different fields that were at the time demanded by the Japanese side and were happily given from the German side. And we have a lot of long-standing relations, for example, in the medical field, but also in the legal field and in many areas where our exchange has been very close for now more than 1.5 centuries. And I think that explains why also in business terms we have since long close relations, because countries that have the same legal system, very comparable legal system, also have a very good basis to work together. After the Second World War, both our countries had suffered very much from the war that they had started. Both countries lay in ruins and have then started a very strong recovery. We have taken different paths as regards our own security policy. The situation in Asia and in Europe being very different after the Second World War. Europe faced a very strong threat from the Soviet Empire, and as a consequence, forged its own security alliance with the US, but within NATO in a broad range of nations. And on the other hand, the Western European nations at the time decided to embark on a strong economic integration in what was then called the European Communities and later the European Union. And I think that has very much shaped our foreign policy approach, whereas Japan, having only one ally, which was the United States since the Second World War, and no regional organization like the European Union could develop here in the region. I think that that has imprinted on our respective foreign policies, but it has never prevented us from working very closely together in the international field. And being both close allies of the United States, I think we can say that we have always been very much united in the Western camp in general, but have not been together in any kind of security alliance. And it's also clear that Japan has very much focused in its foreign policy on the relations with the partners in Asia, but without having any kind of very, very close alliance in that respect. What did that mean for our relations in the last decades? Although we had slightly different approaches, as I described, I think both our countries very much are based on the view that the international order has to be directed by rules. So it has to be rules-based with the UN at its core, and that the role of human rights, of democratic standards, and that principles as territorial integrity have to be respected. I think that has been a clear and constant line in our policies all over these decades. From the 70s on, we have developed a framework of cooperation which was more designed to direct monetary policy than anything else. At the beginning, the G7. And I think it's very interesting to see that this group of the 7 most industrialized nations that was founded more or less because of monetary problems in the 70s has now developed into a coordination forum in almost all fields. I mean, now with the Japanese presidency, I could practically see what it means when all the ministers that we have, I mean, all the 15 German ministers in all different fields have been invited to Japan to 15 ministerial G7 meetings going into very, very detailed in their respective fields, and be it climate, energy, justice, transport, whatever. So the G7 have really built a very, very deep and wide coordination forum to coordinate our policies in very many fields, primarily in the field of international cooperation, but also we are discussing on many policies that have more to do with the domestic affairs. And that means that we have reached, although not in a formal alliance or in a formal supranational union as we are in Europe, but we have reached a stage where our policies are extremely closely coordinated. And I have to say the Japanese presidency has done a great job in this respect this year, and has further intensified that kind of a cooperation. And in the last years also we had very, very close bilateral relations. I think we have never seen such an intensity of mutual bilateral visits. Our chancellor has been in Japan now, so our Prime Minister Shusho has been in Japan in 1.5 years of his tenure already 3 times. I think that's unheard of in German-Japanese relations, and also unheard of in the relations with many other countries. Our economic relations have been strong over the last decades. I don't think they are as strong as they can be. I think there is still a lot of room to expand. And that is something we are actually very strongly working on. How can we intensify our political relations, and how can we intensify our economic relations? And to make the story short, I think in principle, what unites us is that we are in a very similar situation in the international field. We are both of comparable size, Germany and Japan, in the world. So the 3rd and the 4th biggest economies worldwide. We are both strong security providers, and we have strong armies, but maybe not strong enough to face the challenges of the 21st century, and particularly not facing them alone. So both countries are embarking on new security policies, as shown in our national security strategies, that both countries have just recently issued. We also know that on the field of economic security, we are facing challenges that we have not been facing over the last 30 years of intense globalization. So the presumption has always been whatever you need in the world, you can buy it anywhere, and whatever you can sell properly, you should have a chance to sell it anywhere. But we are seeing that both the question of the supply lines and the question of open markets are not developing as positively as we have had hoped for. And that means that those countries who rely on open supply lines and rely on open markets, and Germany and Japan as strong industrialized nations and strong export nations both do so, that we have to combine forces to achieve these interests or to implement these interests that we have. Because in the end, we are strong countries, but maybe not strong enough to secure our supply lines, not strong enough to convince other countries to be as open-minded in their market policies as we would like them to be. And that has brought us together in very concrete terms, Germany and Japan. So it's not just nice political visits. It really goes down very much to concrete policy alignments in energy, in the energy field, the field of climate policies, but how do we manage energy change? How do we manage our supplies with critical raw materials? How do we manage to see that our industries are well supplied with sustainable energy in the future? I think that's what we are facing on a bilateral basis, and on a broader scale, I think we are very much aware that the international order is changing rapidly and not in a positive direction. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has made these risks very, very clear. It's very close to Europe, so first time since the Second World War, we have the feeling that there is an imminent threat to the eastern borders of NATO. Yes, during the Cold War, we also were facing a very strong military threat of the Soviet Union. Should not underestimate that, but after 1990, we somewhat hoped that this immediate military threats for Europe would be over. We are now recognizing this is not the case, and we have to position our military accordingly, and our whole security policy has to be aligned with that. And we're also recognizing that security cannot be regionalized. We cannot only look at security only in Europe or only in Asia or only in other parts of the world. We know the world is very interconnected, and that's why we very much appreciate the close coordination that we have with Japan on the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Yeah, maybe if you allow, I will leave it with that as an introductory remark, and then let's enter into a discussion on many of the problems that we are facing together. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. Problems are also opportunities. It's very good to know, that the coordination, is not just sort of pinpoint in specific silos, but if I read your remarks correctly, that is actually quite coordinated, right, across a whole variety of interconnected fields, and that the cooperation between Germany and Japan, has been strengthened. Because, just I think 4 or 5 years ago even, there was a little bit of a perception amongst the Japanese that all the Germans care about is China. And so, you were very busy then with all the Germans visiting China. Tell me a little bit about sort of, how the perception within Germany, right, sort of has changed and has evolved vis-a-vis Japan over the last 4 or 5 years.
I think the strong focus on the growing market in China has not only been visible in Germany, that was also the case in Japan. I think we all have seen the very strong growth rates in China and the great opportunities that this offered for our companies. And both Japanese and German and other European enterprises have been quite successful in the Chinese market. So I don't blame anybody for doing that, because obviously China is an interesting economic partner. Maybe we have, since all companies have only limited resources to concentrate on opening markets elsewhere, we have maybe not had enough light put on the opportunities in the Japanese market. That is definitely changing. So all the companies in Germany are rethinking how they can better diversify their risks, but also how they can better use opportunities in other markets and not put all the eggs in the Chinese basket alone. I think that is a very clear way you can see. And We can see that in the visits of businessmen from Germany. So CEOs and members of the board of German companies are very frequently coming to Japan now that the borders are open. That's something I really could see over the last 9 months intensifying very visibly. So the interest of doing business in Japan is very much there. And it's a different setting than it has been in China, because in China, German companies, as the Japanese companies in China, have put up production sites to avail of the cheaper production costs in China and to penetrate the Chinese market from within. So there are German companies producing in Japan and there are Japanese companies producing in Germany, but that has, in both cases, not been the major focus. And the major focus has not been investments in the other country. It has been more either trade, technological exchange, or doing business together in third markets. I think that is what has imprinted our business relations over the last decades. My very strong feeling is that we will see a quite remarkable intensification in technological cooperation, because both our economies face huge tasks of transformation. So we have to digitalize our economies and the companies. We have to manage a tremendous change in the energy field, and that will require enormous investments that for sure will overburden individual companies, but I think it will also overburden even strong major economies, national economies as the Japanese and the German. So these huge costs of technology development, of research, will have to be shared. I see a strong logic in the German and the Japanese companies to join forces here. There will be different combinations. I'm sure some of the solutions will be developed in one country alone. Some of the solutions will be developed among European partners. But if you look at the industrial strengths in this world, definitely Japan has to offer quite a lot. And we had very good experiences in the past. So Siemens Fujitsu was a quite successful joint venture. It has stopped operating because the companies had the feeling it's not profitable enough at a certain stage and we better orientate otherwise. But it was never a sense of, oh, this has not worked. The Germans and the Japanese, they can't do it together. So I'm seeing a lot of joint ventures, or at least joint endeavors between European, German, and Japanese companies in technology development. I think that's the major field of future cooperation.
It's very interesting. This cooperation, between Japan and Germany is some great success model in the business world. As you probably know, in the Bundesliga, the German, now basically every team, they have at least 1 or 2 Japanese players. And as you know very well, there's room for cooperation in Germany. In the gossip is all that, well, if only the Japanese players who played in the Bundesliga had played for the German national team, then maybe Germany would have won the World Cup. So maybe there's room for further cooperation. I want to pivot a little bit, if you don't mind, into Germany itself, because there are obviously historic similarities at many different levels between Japan and Germany. But there's also, some great differences. And one of the big differences, obviously, is this whole stance towards immigration. I mean, if you look specifically at immigration, if I get my numbers correctly, into Germany last year, right, more than 1 million people, right? Obviously, with the conflict in the Ukraine, but also from some of the other countries. Can you tell us a little bit about what maybe Japan can learn, right, from Germany's immigration policy, and just your view on that?
Yeah, we are very much aware in Germany that we need migration to fill the shortages in the labor force. I think that's very obvious. We have just passed a new law trying to attract a qualified labor force worldwide, and we are strengthening our infrastructure, for example, in the visa sections at the embassies worldwide, to process the applications, because it's not an easy thing. You have to check whether these people are really the qualified ones that you want. But definitely there is a change in the political concept of migration. In principle, Germany has said we are not a migration country, but we take in asylum seekers. So we have received quite a number of people coming to our country for political reasons as asylum seekers, or we have received illegal migration. We have not really officially said we are a country for migration and we want legal migration. Mm-hmm. And that is a big change. That is what we are aspiring now. But we also continue to get a lot of people who are asylum seekers, or, as you say, have fled the war in Ukraine. So more than 1 million people came from Ukraine alone, came to Germany, and we have taken them in because we know that they were in a very difficult situation and we wanted to assist them. But we're also facing a serious problem of illegal migration. Mm-hmm. So the European Union is at the moment in very intense discussions, and that has just been discussed on the leaders level in the European Council very intensely, how we can better control the illegal migration, and how we can streamline our asylum seeker processes to make sure that those who have little or no chances of ever being acknowledged as asylum seekers are then in a European or are controlled in a European process that does organize the asylum processes all over Europe, and it's not only done in the individual countries. So I think we have to separate between these three groups, so the legal migration, the asylum seekers, and the illegal migration. The influx of workforce has definitely helped us at the moment where we all see that there is a lack of workforce, even in less qualified areas. But definitely we are also aware that if we want to make migration and integration of those who migrate successful, there are certain prerequisites that have to be fulfilled, and maybe the most important one is language training. So people have to be trained in the language of the country, because otherwise if they don't speak the language of the country properly, after a while their integration into the society is very difficult. I mean, that's one of the lessons I think we learned. We have to, if you have people who stay in the country for longer, you have to take a lot of efforts to make their integration as smooth as ever possible. That is not a process that is happening alone.
Any specific lessons for Japan, or I mean, the language training you mentioned?
Yeah, I think that it's the language training. It's the question: how do you find out who are those qualified people that you need, that your workforce really needs, and that requires a very sober analysis, because it's not only IT engineers. I mean, that's obvious. The whole world looks for them. But we see now in Europe, for example, that truck drivers are also missing. So I think you need a very clear analysis of what the economic needs of the country are. And I think it is rather clear that once you offer migration, it is a long-term process. It is not, people will not come only for 1 or 2 or 3 years and then return. Normally, if they are coming to the country with a long-term work perspective, they want to bring their families in. So that is something where we have to be, I think, honest to ourselves. You cannot invite people to come and think that they will always be single and never bring a family. So family policy, allowing people to move in and stay and have a normal family life, bring in their family members, I think that's something that has to be part of the package.
Yeah. I mean, it is actually quite interesting if you analyze and look at the German big companies, the German listed companies, right? You actually find that over the last 15 years that there's quite a change in terms of the sort of makeup, of the board and of the senior leaders, right? We're really, people who have a migration background, have really made it up to the top, of some of the German companies. So that's I think I think you'll be hard pressed to find that sort of experience, sort of here in Japan. So it's exactly that strategic, long-term focus, right? That no, this is not just a place where you come for a couple of years to make some money. This is a place where you actually have a career and you can actually be successful, in that career and have something very sustainable, right? Let me pivot one more thing. Differences and similarities, energy policy, right? Sometimes I think just sitting here in Japan, I think Germany now has switched off all the nuclear reactors. There's obviously the gas problem, with Russia. Can you help us understand a little bit about sort of German energy policy? If you need some schnapps,
no.
then please let me know, because it's
no, an energizing coffee is wonderful for that. No, yes, we have very strongly been relying on Russian gas imports, with the illusion, we have to be frank on that, with the illusion that they would be safe even when political problems arise, because that has been the experience we have made with the Soviet Union, even during Cold War times, when we had millions of soldiers on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Still, the gas supplies always came unhindered from the Soviet Union. And so we thought this would also be the case with Russia, where we have less, where we had less ideological conflicts for quite a while. In the 90s and the 2000s, we had the feeling that Russia is going in a good direction of democratic development, maybe not in a perfect, but in a constantly positive direction. So we could rely on these imports long term. That definitely was an error. And we had to correct this error in very short time. So within few months, I think we have managed relatively well with that. So we replaced the deliveries of gas through pipelines from Russia by LNG deliveries. We had to build new LNG ports that were not existent in Germany. We have managed to do that now within 1 year. 2 new ones are still coming. So I think our LNG capacities will be sufficient to guarantee the supply next winter. The second element, you are right. The German policy makers have decided already 11 years ago, after Fukushima, to phase nuclear energy completely out. And that policy has been pursued consistently. And the last 3 reactors we had have been closed at the end of April. There was a discussion in Germany whether they should be continued, yes or no. The government has finally decided not to do so. First of all, because the declared policy has always been we'll finish with nuclear energy in 2022, and if so, we prolong only a very, very short period. But also because all the maintenance cycles of the 3 remaining nuclear power plants had finished. So we would have had to make huge investments to see that the nuclear power plants continue. And since they are anyway providing only 4% of our energy supplies, then the government said that's not worth these huge investments. And I think that is the big difference between the discussion in Germany and in Japan. It's a question of the security of nuclear power plants. I mean, that was the main argument in the past in the discussions, and that was the major argument after Fukushima, saying, okay, we see even a country like Japan cannot manage this technology safely, so it cannot be guaranteed that it's a safe technology. That the security concerns were always in the forefront. But in the last years, I would say in the German discussion, also the financial aspect was very strongly discussed, saying if you take in the very long-term costs of decommissioning old nuclear power plants and of disposing of the nuclear waste. If you take all these long-term costs, nuclear power is just too expensive. So I think the argument has shifted from the purely security side, saying, okay, it's cheap energy, but it's not safe enough, to a discussion where we say, maybe we can make it safe enough, also with smaller reactors and modular reactors or whatever we possible. But whatever we do, it will be extremely costly because the renewables are now so much cheaper than they have been 10 years before. And we now see that the long-term costs of nuclear energy are so much higher than we thought in the 70s and 80s when we started with these policies, that at least for the time being, I see no political majority in Germany for a restart of the nuclear energy. So that is a discussion which will not come up. But I know it's active in Japan, so that's a big difference. I think the very strong similarity is that both our countries are very much dependent on energy imports. We except coal, Germany does not have natural resources for energy. So the use of coal, we are definitely phasing out because of climate reasons, meaning that we are dependent on imports of fossil fuels. And that for us is also a very strong argument for changing into renewables. Because if you can increase the percentage of renewables, and we have reached now almost 50% of renewables in our primary power supply, that means this is energy you don't have to import because the wind is there. And the sun is unfortunately not so intense in Germany, but some sun is also in the country. Meaning our policy of strengthening the renewables is not just a policy designed to help fighting climate change, but it's also a policy designed to strengthen our economic security. Yeah. And that's maybe a discussion that is not as intense in Japan yet. So in Japan, I see the discussion more somewhere we will get our energy imports, where we just have to diversify our sources where we get it from. And maybe the prospect of renewables are not as positively seen as they are in Germany. We are quite convinced that we can increase further the percentage of renewables, and we are striving for that. Whether the more cautious Japanese approach is the right one, I think we will see that in the years to come. We also see very good business opportunities. We think that if the renewable technologies are mainly developed in Germany, this will be a huge export business in the future, because we do believe strongly that other parts of the world will also change to renewables. So that heavily investing now in research and development of these technologies will help develop our exports later.
Yeah. Fantastic. In that regard, let me pivot to one other area where there's obviously great similarities between Japan and Germany, which is the leadership of the United States. There's obviously a very significant dependence for security, for Japan. In the security arena, it's a little bit more mitigated because of the NATO structure in Germany. But when we look at economic policy, there has been some fairly dramatic change in the United States over the last 15 months with this Inflation Reduction Act. Wonderful word. Inflation Reduction Act. Nobody knows why inflation keeps on going up, but obviously it's a very, very aggressive America First industrial policy. And as you recall, sort of within 36 hours of President Biden brokering that deal, right? Within 36 hours, you had Toyota, Keyence, Panasonic, and 3 or 4 other Japanese companies announcing about $22 billion of new factories, of new investments in the United States. And since then, I think there's about $400 billion of additional foreign direct investment that has been triggered by America sort of running a very, very domestic focused industrial policy. How does Germany deal with that? What's your perception of that? I mean, there's obviously China as an actor on the supply chain side, but something significant has changed over the last 15 months, in terms of the biggest economy in the world, the biggest market in the world, no longer, being as open as it used to be, and now actually running an industrial policy. What's your perception of that, and how does German industry react to that?
In this field, I think Germany and Japan have very similar interests because also both our countries have the US market as a very strong export market. Both our countries have been openly critical on the Inflation Reduction Act because definitely it contains provisions that disadvantage our companies. I think we had a two-track approach. One is intense discussions with the US administration on adapting some of the regulations of the IRA in a way that it makes it more acceptable for us, so that it disprivileges the foreign companies less. And I think there are still options to improve the situation for our companies. But definitely, I see the same trend as you described, also with the German companies. Yes, they have intensified investments in the US to fulfill the requirements of the IRA, that certain elements of production, or quite a considerable element of production, has to be in North America. I mean, that was a trend that anyway was ongoing. So many of the bigger German companies have already set up production in the United States, as they have set up production in China. So it's no longer the case that we would deliver finished goods completely produced in Europe and then just ship them to the US and sell them there. There are still some products where we do that, but there is a lot of production already ongoing. For sure, that will intensify. But we will also, in the European context, and Japan is doing the same, we'll also see that we support our own industries in Europe. And what we, I think, have to achieve is that we don't enter into a race of subsidies between the US and Europe and Japan. So companies can then freely choose where do they get the biggest subsidies, and can go from one to another and do subsidy shopping and say, oh, the other one pays me more. I think that's something which we have to avoid. And that will require continuous and intense discussion with the Biden administration. I do believe that Germany and Japan, having, as I said, rather identical interests here, are also talking in very similar ways to the US administration in this respect.
Let me ask one final question, and please prepare your questions after that, which is pivoting back to Asia. Taiwan, in your personal opinion, and having been the ambassador in Beijing, sort of lessons from the war of aggression in the Ukraine, lessons from your personal assessment of Xi Jinping and his ambitions. How would you look, at the Taiwan situation?
Yeah, I think we just have to take the facts as they are. And the fact is that China, over the last decade, since 1949, has always insisted that Taiwan is part of the motherland, and that there's only one China, and this is represented by Beijing. But the tone has become more aggressive over the last years. I think that's something which we have to state. China has never excluded the use of military power to regain the unity of the country as they see it. But I think the tone is much more, I have to say, aggressive, yes, than it has been in the past. The second fact we have to state is that there is a very strong military buildup on the Chinese side. So the People's Liberation Army has increased its capacities tremendously over the last years. I mean, if you look alone on how many ships does the Chinese Navy get every year, if you look at the size of, for example, the German Navy or other European navies, that is a very considerable increase in China. So the increase of ships in China in 1 year is about the size of the German Navy. So we have to state that, and it's not only the Navy forces, it's the rocket, the missile forces, the amphibious forces, and so on. So I think we have to recognize that the Chinese military buildup has been very, very strong over the last years. And also that's not the immediate vicinity of Taiwan, but China has fortified these islands in the South China Sea. So it's building up a very strong military infrastructure there. And also in the East China Sea has intensified its presence. I mean, not openly declared as a Navy presence, but in fact, it's at least a Coast Guard, if not a Navy presence we see from China in the East China Sea. So these are the facts. And if you look at these facts, you can hardly have a lot of optimism that the Taiwan question is getting less difficult. I think every conclusion you have to draw from that is that it is getting more problematic. And the question is, at what point in time does the Chinese military have such a superiority in the Taiwan Strait or in the East China Sea that the military pressure can easily be transformed in very strong political pressure? So to say, we are threatening with the use of military power, and we have it. And I don't say military power will necessarily be used, but if you have military capacities that are sufficient for an invasion of Taiwan, this will be a strong tool, also a strong political tool. And I think we have to be aware of the fact that this political and military pressure might be used. And when we now see the number of overflights from the Chinese Air Force into the airspace of Taiwan and the very strong presence of Navy ships around Taiwan, of the Chinese Navy, or sometimes even together with Russian ships. I mean, all these are signs that a military escalation cannot be excluded. And that's why we have strongly, also in the G7 context in this year in Hiroshima and at other occasions before that, we have very strongly made the point that any solution of the Taiwan question and any movement in the Taiwan Strait may only be peaceful. And I think that's the strong signal we have to continue to give.
Excellent. Any questions from the audience?
Very much. Guy Delamotte from INALCO in Paris. Ambassador, thank you very much for this talk. I do have a question. We were short-sighted in believing the Chinese regime would change. We were short-sighted in believing the Russian regime had changed. How can we avoid being short-sighted in such a way? And I have in mind in particular energy policy that we talked about, and the dependency on renewables. You said renewables were cheaper. They're cheaper in part because they're being produced by China. And we have this 2035 deadline in Europe now to shift our cars from one type to another. If we could have your insights, please.
Yeah, a German football player, Lothar Matthäus, once said, you have to be very careful with prognosis, particularly when they concern the future. And I think that's a major problem we are facing, not only in sports, but also in politics. Without joking, I think we have to see that major political decisions are still taken also in the world of the 21st century by individual leaders. So the war and aggression in Ukraine was definitely a decision made by Putin himself. It was not something that was prepared long in the leading circles in Russia, and by just listening to many people in Moscow, one could have sensed that coming. I think you could see it coming when the military buildup was on the way. But the decision when Putin decided to do it was taken by him alone. And to predict that is not easy. So I think you have to use all the analysis tools that we have, but we will have to face the fact that in countries that are dominated by a single person, the will of this single person is not easy to detect, and the will of this single person can suddenly lead to policy decisions which we did not foresee coming. And I have no better answer to this than, yes, we have to use all the tools we have. And the second is we have to prepare for different scenarios. So that's maybe something where in the last 30 years, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the experience has been things have been going in the right direction in security terms, and we have then thought, okay, if in the 90s and the 2000s security problems, at least interstate security problems, were much less dominant than in the Cold War times, and we were more concentrating on regional conflicts, crises within some countries, terrorism. So quite a different form of conflict. So I remember very well in the 2000s, we were very much concentrated also in our security policy on having the capacity to deal with insecurity in certain countries in Africa and other parts of the world, but we were not really facing a great interstate conventional military conflict. Now we see that might have been too optimistic. We have to prepare for this scenario too. And in order to avoid it, you better be well prepared. And that's why we are all now increasing very much our defense capabilities. So maybe politically, the right answer is scenario thinking and not excluding scenarios just because we think we would not do it. I mean, you cannot think that a leader of a country necessarily acts in the same way as the leaders of our countries would act. But that will require, I mean, let's be frank, that will require quite a lot of resources that we would have often liked to use elsewhere. I mean, we are not investing in our military capacities just like that. It's a costly affair, and it will require resources that we would have liked to spend elsewhere also. But that is definitely one of the conclusions we have to draw. And that's why in the new national security strategy that Germany has just published, it starts with we have to give robust answers. So it has three main elements. One is robust answer. The second is it has to be resilient answer. So we have to prepare our own infrastructure in a resilient way. And the third is we have to do it in a sustainable way. So meaning security also is depending on climate questions and questions of sustainability. But the first of the three elements that is mentioned is robust answers. And I think that's the conclusion we have to draw.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time. Noah Snyder from The Economist. We've been talking about the security policy changes in Japan and in Germany, revisions of national security strategies. I'm wondering how those processes have informed each other, what you're learning from your Japanese counterparts and perhaps what they're interested in learning from you and your German colleagues. Thank you.
Yeah, I can confirm that we have quite an intense discussion from the leaders level. As I mentioned, the chancellor has been 3 times in Japan, but there are even more conversations at other occasions. So from the leaders level down to security experts between the foreign ministries, the defense ministries, also our defense minister has been here. So we are really in a very intense discussion. What does it mean for our security policy as such? But also down to a very detailed level of what does it really mean for our military capacities and how can we adapt them? How can we strengthen our own armament industries? Because it's very obvious that we have a problem in supplying our armies. It's not just a question of the political will and the finances. It's also, we see that now very clearly for our own armed forces. It's also a question, how do you produce all the capabilities that we are now seeing that we need? And also in this field, maybe there is a future room for future cooperation between European and Japanese companies. But I can assure you, the security experts between the foreign ministries, the think tankers, a lot is ongoing on very different levels to compare what we are doing, to inform each other and to learn from each other.
Good morning. I'm a big admirer of Germany, actually. So, I wanted to say that up front, and not just because Jesper is my friend, but more importantly because I'm like you. Actually, I'm looking at the facts and the figures, and the one which is actually in my mind the most staggering one is actually GDP per cap. When you look at Germany and Japan, and again, as we said earlier, these are very similar countries. They lost the World War. They started from zero, engineering-driven, export economies. Now very strong creditor nations. All these kind of things, and roughly the same population now, by the way, roughly, right? And when you look at GDP per cap, Japan is $38,000 per cap, and Germany is $58,000 per cap. There's a difference of $20,000 per cap, which relatively again seem, similar economy. So I guess, you talked about, we're talking about, what Japan can learn from Germany from a political standpoint, from a, military standpoint, immigration standpoint, as you say, yes, but for me, the biggest question is what can Japan learn from Germany from a business standpoint? How do you analyze this huge difference in GDP per cap in light of the fact that these are fundamentally similar economies, or at least on paper? I mean, this is just staggering for me. So I just wanted to know if you have any perspective on that, and if you actually give advice to your Japanese friends in terms of how maybe economic policies in Germany did a few, obviously we know the Schroeder's years in 2005 and 6 when it totally radically changed the labor market. We mentioned also earlier about the immigration policy. I don't know if that's actually a driver of all this, but I'm totally astonished by the gap between these two countries.
Yeah, that is a very, very tricky question. I mean, what you can see is that productivity growth, all in all, has been higher in Germany over the last 20 years than in Japan. And I think that mainly explains the difference in GDP per capita. Another explanation is obviously the weak yen at the moment. So I think if you look at the figures now, it's maybe a little bit distorting. If you look at it, yes, but at the moment, I mean, for a certain moment in time, the German GDP was for a week even higher than the Japanese, but that was a question of the exchange rate. I mean, Jesper Koll is a much greater expert on Japanese economy than I am. But maybe, if I may say that, we have been less generous in supplying our economy with money in Germany over the last 20 years, or 10 years at least. So we have maybe forced our companies and our economy stronger into adaptation processes because they had much more problems in supplying themselves with capital that was cheap. And in Japan, capital was rather cheap. I mean, that was a deliberate policy, but maybe it has avoided some difficult adaptation processes that, I mean, are painful for individual companies, but overall then, as we see, lead to higher productivity in those who are forced to adaptation. But maybe that's the only thing I would see here.
It's a very interesting question, right? And at the end of the day, the quick answer, and I think that the most proper answer is actually the difference in age, right? In the sense of that here in Japan, 1 in 4 is now over the age of 70. Right? Germany is a relatively young country in comparison to Japan. Now, everybody's young relative to Japan. But we got to wait like another 15 years, then China will be just as old. It's actually interesting, because people compare, and this is a long discussion we can have at a separate session maybe. People compare economies to economies, but the implicit assumption is that the age profile is actually the same, which is not the case. If you and I were biologists, we would never compare, different bacteria of different ages, right? They all have to be normalized for that. So it's quite interesting from that perspective. But the one point, just want to leave you with the fact that Germany and Japan have something in common, which is that the political representation, right, of age is actually very, very good. You find that in Germany now, the average age of the population is about 42, right? But the average age of a German politician is now 51. In Japan, the average age is now 50. And the average age of an elected politician is 56. Actually, the narrowest gap in the G7. Now, of course, for our American friends, the average American is now 34, but the average American politician is now 65. It's actually the widest gap that you actually have there.
Yes, we have two questions, and I'll consolidate the two. One is on energy, and the other is on women's positioning. So one question about energy is, Japan and Germany and other European countries have increased reliance on LNG imports. The demand has pushed prices up, making energy unaffordable for developing countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. How can Germany and Japan support energy access in the developing world? The other question with regards to the women's positioning is, could you consider the difference between Japan and Germany in terms of women's positioning in society? This is not just in terms of top business positions, but more importantly, throughout the education system. How can girls be raised differently to develop their sense of agency and power?
Yeah, the first question on energy prices worldwide, yes, that's indeed a serious problem that energy prices have been rising. I mean, fortunately, they have already come down quite considerably, but that is a definite problem. And at the same time, many countries in the world also have to face additional challenges deriving from climate change. So for many countries, the burden is very high. What have we tried to do? I think we have intensified our financing for managing the climate change. So Germany has really done a lot to fulfill our obligations to feed in this 100 billion climate fund that has been agreed upon internationally. And we are also continuing with a very strong development cooperation with countries affected. On the second question, as regards gender equality, if I may put that in this general term, the discussion in Germany has been twofold over the last decades. It started very strongly with a feminist movement in the 70s, and that was very much concentrated on the very right and undeniable aspect of individual justice. So why should a woman be treated differently from a man? Or why should somebody with a different sexual orientation be treated differently from somebody else? That was but in general terms, that was regarded to be a question of justice in society and has been tackled like that, but tackled rather early and intensively. And we had a long discussion about quota, which we have now both in politics and in business. And it has proven to be a tool that has worked, but we have used other tools. We had strong investments in families policy, childcare facilities that have been improved, legal provisions that have allowed fathers to take paternity leave, and so on. All the big range of measures that we have taken, but the discussion has now very much shifted also to the field of from only looking at aspects of individual justice, looking at what does the society as a whole require. And since we are having also a negative demographic development in Germany, it is very clear that we need to better use the female workforce just to make our economy survive. And so that, I think, is a big change in the discussion, because also now the companies themselves, they not only policy driven, but driven by the need to find the qualified workforce, are taking a lot of measures that allow women to strive in business and thereby improve gender equality. I think that's one of the major points I would like to make.
First of all, I know we're not starting the debate club, but in response to Kenji's question, it struck me that the difference between Japan and Germany, the single biggest difference is immigration policy. There's been significant immigration into Germany from Turkey and many other places, and refugees, and Japan simply doesn't do that. And in the United States, obviously, we have legal immigration, so we're forever young, forever growing, perhaps is a phrase we might want to employ. But not to debate that here and now in immigration policy. Mr. Ambassador, you've served in some very interesting places in the world where there's a significant amount of growth and energy, but also here's my question to you, and this actually it stems from discussions with Kevin Rudd, who's also been a very good friend of the Asia Society, a former prime minister and ambassador now to the United States, and why he goes back to the United States as ambassador. Here's my question. Sorry, I'm going long-winded. The places you've served, to what extent have you seen over the last 20 or 30 years differentiation in the ability of the, if you will, the not always elected, but for the political control of a country to maintain separation from the military side of the country? The question being, is there room for mistakes? We talk about how we avoid a war. We talk about how we avoid this growing confrontational environment in Asia, particularly with China as an example. And it seems to me that over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, there's been a significant amount of complacency on the political side that things are going to work out. Yet, while we've been doing this, the military capacity has been growing rather dramatically. China is the easiest and simplest example. To what extent, and you've worked in places like Turkey and Israel and other places where you can see a similar sort of militarization, to what extent do you worry in today's world, with a different world since February 2022, that a military accident or military need to respond might overcome the political ability to control it? Sorry, that was long-winded, and I hope it was clear. But I think it's an essential question for everyone to understand as we talk about employing industrial policy or re-employing industrial policy, and how that will affect political decision-making and military decision-making.
Yeah, that is a question that would require another long breakfast to answer. To make it short, I think we have developed quite useful tools after the end of the Cold War, and maybe even before that in the 80s already. So these were disarmament tools, tools of mutual control, open skies, the KSE treaty, where we had the ability to inspect foreign forces on the spot. So a lot of tools have been developed to reduce the risk of military escalation and guarantee a political control of it. Unfortunately, Russia in the last 10 years has actively renounced these instruments. And all our attempts to revive nuclear disarmament and to keep the conventional armament provisions in place have not been successful with Russia. What is the conclusion? I think the first is, as we discussed before, our answer has to be robust and deterrence. We cannot just hope that things will develop, but we should not enter necessarily into a circle of armament, rearmament, again armament, but we should always have these disarmament incentives open. And as we have been willing to do that in the past with Russia, we should, and we have been asking for that, also be very much willing to do transparency measures. That is the main element, I think, of controlling accidental military escalation. So we should always be willing and hope that we find partners for transparency measures and manage disarmament, in particular nuclear disarmament, wherever we can. But we have to be aware that this is a development which we cannot force others to do. We have to convince them to do so, and let's hope that we will be able to continue returning on that path. But I think that will be my short answer to a very complicated question.
Your Excellency, thank you very, very much for being so frank, for being so candid.